twice a year, we remember those patriots who lived and died for the American way of life by taking a holiday. We pile into our campers for a trip to the woods, or into our sports cars for a weekend at the beach, or into our backyards for a cookout with friends. It's a kind of celebration, I suppose, and not altogether an unfitting one. And we celebrate with more direct patriotism, some places, by gathering along parade routes where cars full of local politicians, assorted first aid trucks and fire trucks, and a variety of high school bands march by in solemn but spirited tribute to the honored forefathers and defenders of the nation. In such ways, July 4th is celebrated as a highlight in American history. Yet one wonders whether the nation has any business, when honoring those who forged and died for its highest principles, to celebrate at all. Maybe the nation ought instead to be taking a long, sober look at itself. For we, like all the other nations whose glory has faded into the dusts of history, have an Achilles heel. The Constitution and the military can preserve the possibility of American greatness, but if the society does not preserve the reality, what irony in the American experiment. The patriot can die for the highest values of his country, but if the citizen doesn't live for them, what tragedy in our defenders' graves. We can win the battles, but lose the war. And I want to suggest today that the American citizen is seeing to it that we do just that. While our young sacrifice at the altar of freedom in the four corners of the world, Americans at home have quietly let themselves fall victim to four vast, killing slaveries. The slavery of the lost conscience, the lost neighbor, the lost God, and the lost challenge, with but one word at the bottom to sum it up: lost. The story of how this all came about doesn't take long in telling. It was only as far back as 1850 or thereabouts that our standards of conscience began to disintegrate in earnest. It started to seem as though right and wrong weren't really rooted in anything much that you could hang on to. There wasn't any sure hitching post anywhere in the universe anymore. If you were a professor, you studied behavior patterns and blamed them on social maladjustments. If you were a theologian, you whittled down the gospel to a formula for self-help and feeling better about life. If you were an ordinary citizen, you simply shrugged your shoulders and went about your business in your own way. There was some tension in your soul, but not much. Certainly not enough to make it worth God's while to go to so much trouble in heaven because of the wrong he thought was under it. It wasn't your fault. It was the way things were. And people had to be practical. They had to look out for themselves. It's almost inconceivable that such a disorder as we've built could ever have gotten hold in a professedly Christian America, but it did. We weren't anybody's neighbor anymore. We were the tenant that lived in the apartment next door and made the stairs creak late at night. We weren't stewards any longer, but shareholders who bought and sold in distant markets with pure profit as our motive. We weren't evangelists then. We joined a citizens committee. Lazarus didn't lie at anybody's gate anymore, full of sores. He was case 3486BX in the county hospital. Brotherhood was a phrase. The facts were white, black, and yellow, Methodist, Baptist, Lutheran, Presbyterian, and Roman Catholic, Jew and German and Japanese. What would you expect to see happen in a situation like that, where the only down-to-earth relationships left between one man and another lay in the realms of either politics or economics? Whatever we might expect, we know now what we got. Fascism and Nazism first, and then communism. There was no other answer, with God gone. And he was. For one reason or another, to the crowd on the sidewalk, he just didn't seem necessary anymore. There was nothing that called for him. You built your own world without him, of gadgets and the parading inventions of science. Never mind his law, never mind his intentions. There was a kind of thrust about life, you thought, that would keep it moving up all by itself. So the evolutionist said, so the humanist said, so the progressive said, and almost everybody believed it. Religion was an annex, where a person, if indeed he were still a person at all, might sit and contemplate the meaning of things if he wished, or have his so-called sins forgiven. But as far as the actual dynamics of Western civilization were concerned, God was not there. So there came about in this life of ours a dreadful and abysmal sense of futility. Life had lost its challenge. Well, there were plenty of things to attend to every day, mind you, but we had no mission left, no commanding purpose, no end to serve. We amounted to very little, and we knew it. Ask the next person you meet what his purpose is. He got himself together a lot of worthless property and silly self-delusions to replace the dignity he'd lost. He was important in the company. He was a wealthy man. He was this and that, but over his head, the sheer and utter meaninglessness of it all lowered like a cloud. The sun was gone, and he hardly cast a shadow anymore. The song died on his lips. The only obvious goal of his existence now was comfort. And nothing pricked him intolerably until it pricked him there. Come to him now in that condition with the vaunted freedom of speech that the Constitution declares as an unalienable right. If the process I've been trying to describe goes far enough, he may not care about freedom of speech much any longer. He may be willing to trade it to get back some of the things that matter more, like some semblance of dignity and decorum in the public image of government officials, for instance. Like the belief that character is of enough value, even in a mass society, that it shouldn't be suspected and impugned at every slight whim. Like the notion that something somewhere in human existence is sacred enough still to inspire awe among people and to be essentially unspeakable and unassailable. It happened in Rome, in Iran, in Argentina. It happened in Russia in 1914. It could happen here. Or tell us of the wonderful freedom of religion that we've fought wars to protect. But we've enjoyed that here in America for years. Thousands of us have been free of it entirely. We know, if we think about it, that these are nothing but symptoms. They don't come anywhere near being a diagnosis. It isn't freedom from fear or freedom from want that we need. It isn't the good life that we lack or require. Our real problem is not political, and it isn't economic. We are face to face not with losing privileges we claim because we're Americans thanks to the military, but thanks to the society with the possibility of losing the stature that makes us human. That's why not just nuclear holocaust, but hell itself could be turned loose here, yeah, even here. When we lose our conscience, our neighbor, our God, our aim in living, it's no trick to fool us into any kind of surrender plan the devil chooses. Any slavery is better than slavery that has squeezed all the meaning from our lives, and it can happen as readily in Washington and Florida and Stuart as in Poland. Why hasn't anybody who has a chance of being believed put his finger on it? Significantly, it is against just this process of dehumanization that the Christian gospel stands with both feet planted. The gospel doesn't address itself to fragmentary ends, like the preservation of democracy. It sets itself to safeguard the soil and soul out of which democracy springs. Those freedoms which gave our freedom birth, and without which nobody can be anything but less than he's capable of being. Here is our tremendous and immediate concern. We are, as a people here in America, trying, as maybe we've never tried before, to plan our way into the future. Surely, there is only one mood that fits us: the sober mood of those who know their commitment needs to be a profound one, who knows that in their decisive grasp is a heritage of such importance that to betray it now by foolishness and disregard would be to wear God's patience thin. We have a tall task to do. Over against the lost conscience of humanity, we have in our keeping the freedom of a truth that is not our own. It's not relative. It's absolute. It didn't grow up by itself under the changing weather of human history. It is the word and will of God in human hearts and the pressure of God on the human soul. It isn't a freedom, therefore, that shifts with the season and has no fastenings anywhere. This freedom out of which democracy grew would never stand for that. It bore its witness, which is what the word Protestant meant once, bore its witness to this slavery, which is perfect freedom. And it made men, not mice. It got on its legs one day in a little town in Worms, and they were the legs of a miner's son, but they were planted sturdily enough against the princes. With the fingers of Andrew Melville, it tugged at the robe of a Scottish king who was prattling on about his rights and said, "Thou, God's silly vassal, there are 2 kings and 2 kingdoms in Scotland, King James and King Jesus Christ, whose subject King James is, and of whose kingdom he is not king, lord, or head, but a member." That is freedom. It is bondage, vertical bondage. Wherever did we get the idea that we could tamper with that bondage and still be free? It is that truth and no other that sets itself over against the lost neighbor to be bone of their bone and flesh of their flesh, blood of their blood, striking our hands together, white hand in black, yellow hand in brown, across everything that divides us, because there is one thing that unites us. And it isn't the Democratic Party. It isn't Americanism. It isn't even our humanity, really. It's the good news today, as it has been the good news every day, that God is in Christ reconciling himself to the world and the world to himself. The gospel of peace that Paul was always talking about, to be like shoes on our feet, making us suddenly aware of the common life around us and of the genuine relationship there is between human beings that can keep us truly human. Call it, if you like, freedom of fellowship. It's the freedom to be something other than a number in a register, one item in a system of mass calculation, more than individual men and women redeemed by God's love even, to be part of his family. We need to remind ourselves of that. It used to be foremost in everybody's minds. Back in the days of Cromwell, there was a man whose name was, praise God, Barebones. He had a brother whose name was more inclusive. It was Jesus Christ came into the world to save Barebones, which is good Presbyterian doctrine. But there was more. There was a third brother whose name was, if Christ had not died for thee, thou hadst been damned, Barebones, which, writes Howard Robinson, was just too much name, so they called him Damn Barebones for short. It's all very well to remember that the Christian gospel exists for us, but the Christian gospel does not even know us apart from the complexities of this human family in which God placed us to live our lives. There is an allegory that puts the matter grimly, but quite well. An anthropologist died and went to heaven. Being a scientist, before accepting an invitation to heaven, he asked to investigate hell. He was shown a vast table spread with all sorts of delicacies, but around it sat cadaverous people, emaciated and starving, their arms bound in front of them, straight and stiff, so that nobody could get his hand to his mouth. It was ghastly and unbearable, and the scientist rushed back to St. Peter saying, that's enough of that, I'm ready now. But there, when the glittering portals opened and the scientist saw heaven, he saw a vast table again with equal bounty and equal hosts gathered round with arms bound straight and stiff in splints. But they were sleek and happy people. I don't understand, the scientist said. The circumstances are the same with this eternity of difference. It's quite simple, really, replied the saint. You can't feed yourself with your arms like that, but you can feed your neighbor. Up here, you see, we've learned to take care of each other. Nobody then can lose his conscience or his neighbor with God around. That's why Paul went on to say, above all, take the shield of faith over against the slavery of the lost God. That's freedom. We can't seem to make anything we try stick if it isn't grounded in reality. And in this real world in which we live, reality is somehow geared to God. Technology isn't all that matters. Knowledge isn't all that life needs to send the blessed things spinning away to paradise on greased wheels. The more we adjust ourselves to fiction, the more our accumulated successes can lead only to ultimate failure and ruin. We're paying a frightful bill for our illusions. This blunt fact stands in front of us. The evil in this world, ladies and gentlemen, is not an accident. It's fundamental. Progress won't rid us of it. We'll only sink deeper into it if we go it alone. It's time that we got to rock bottom. And in you and me, rock bottom is no angel. It's a subterranean lady or gentleman who goes on grinning at education and philosophy and continues to make of life a hell and a disaster. We've got to deal with that, or all our talk about tomorrow is fiddlesticks. And it's precisely here that the problem of freedom becomes religious, as do all the other problems of democracy, of politics, and economics sooner or later. If we plan to build anything, we've got to start building with this perverse stuff of which we are made. Fact, not fancy. Listen, in 6,000 years, we've invented 20-odd civilizations and destroyed every one of them. Today, we're miles nearer self-extinction than we ever were before. What do you think the answer is? Military buildup? Computers? The world court? The next president? Or a radical despair of everything else but a recreated humanity with the tragedy and the triumph of a cross at the heart of it? This last, and all by itself. By way of Calvary, the lost challenge comes winging its way back to life. And take the sword of the Spirit, which is the sword of God. It is the freedom of the human soul to respond, to catch cadence with its high mission again at the roll of that other drum, to set out once more on a pilgrimage with the sound of the trumpet in its ears. They say that's what the devil misses most since he fell from heaven, the sound of the trumpets in the morning. If you look at life and listen, you'll not be asking, what's it all about, Alfie? Not with this crucified Galilean alive. And the gesture that he flings at you, go ye, therefore, staking everything he has on your answer. That's what we're made for. Reminds me of the scene from Robin Hood when that forest bandit settles down to be King Richard's henchman, grows fat in the palace and sleeps late. Until one day, from under a greenwood tree comes the eerie note of Little John's horn, winding over the hills on the drowsy air and through the window and into his room. That room which had been so comfortable before and so deadly. Now he can't stand it. He has to be off. That's how it is. I give you these freedoms over against the crippling slavery of the lost conscience, the lost neighbor, the lost God, and the lost challenge. They are the freedoms of the Christian gospel, and they gave our freedom birth. God's word, God's commonwealth, God's deed, and God's summons. It is these that make America great because they make persons out of its people and they keep its humanity human. They are the four pivotal freedoms of history without which there is no freedom. You don't preserve them by fighting for them. You preserve them by using them, by living them. The Church of Jesus Christ has declared this unfailing testimony to them throughout the ages. God give the church today in us hands and feet and a tongue. On August 24th, in the year of our Lord 410, Alaric the Goth began to sack the Roman Empire. There was chaos. Cities were destroyed. Libraries were burned. Estates were ruined. There was no law. Violence reigned everywhere. There was only the church. And on that wreckage, she built. Now here's the question I want to ask. How did it happen? However did it happen that there was a church there at all? Because for 4 centuries, men and women had been listening to the story of a Nazarene and telling it with gladness and courage. They didn't have to defend in their world their faith in another world. They used it, stalwart as it was, to stem the flood of savagery and chaos around them. And they lifted civilization to a splendor that surpassed the splendor of Rome. Nameless people like us, turning the tides of history. Are we willing in the church to take that step today? What is that step? Hear the admonition. God speaking to the church in Revelation 2:4. But I have this against you, that you have lost the love you had at first. And the promise found in 2 Chronicles chapter 7. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. Amen.